Okay, this last lecture, which will hopefully be a little bit shorter than the last one at least, will deal with American society, how American society was affected by the war, and then the end of the war itself, and what kind of situation we find ourselves in after the war is over. So the crisis of the war altered some of the most basic patterns of American life. About 15 million Americans served in the armed forces, which is about an equal number, rather, moved to find jobs. Millions of women went to work outside the home. Some opportunities in the war also were opened for African Americans and other minorities, the opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. For most servicemen in the war, those that were actually serving were probably more interested in, dry socks and shoes without holes in than they were about sort of ideology and things like that. Very often reluctant recruits were the main sort of force, fighting force, rather than professional soldiers. Most of them have very few aims beyond returning home in one piece. It was 4 long years, though, that these men were fighting this war. And that 4 years changed a lot of them. Millions who had never been far from home were now traveling to unfamiliar cities and remote lands, and in some ways sort of shedding their parochialism. They would share tents and foxholes with people from different countries, different religions, different classes, and you have a kind of melting pot effect, which serves to free at least some of these soldiers from their sort of pre-war prejudices. You also have that going the other way, though. Besides serving with people they had never previously encountered, more than 1 million GIs also married overseas, and broadening their horizons in that way. But like I say, this also went the other way as well. A lot of GIs became even more distrustful of foreigners and outsiders and returned home even more fixated on the American way and on lessening that foreign influence than they were when they went over there. And so the war had a very polarizing effect in that way for the men who actually participated in it. Physical misery, chronic exhaustion, especially intense combat, took a rather heavy toll on those participating and left lasting psychological as well as physical wounds. Both American and Japanese troops regularly saw racist images of the other, being portrayed as sort of animals to be exterminated, and brutality became as much a rule as an exception in what became known, or what became, a war without mercy, essentially, and especially on that American-Japanese front. In the fight against Germany, cruelties and atrocities occurred as well as on the sort of Japanese front, although perhaps to a lesser degree on the German front, at least with regards to soldiers. Some who served became rather cynical about human life. Others were haunted by nightmares of the war and would languish for a long time afterwards in veterans' hospitals with sort of debilitating psychological damage as a result of their participation in the war and in what they did in the name of the war. And so it had a very detrimental effect on those that were sort of on the front lines. On the home front, nothing transformed social topography more than the vast internal migration, which we see overtaking the country. About 15 million men moved because of military service, often accompanied by their family members. Many other Americans moved in order to secure new economic opportunities, especially along the Pacific coast or in the South, to work in munitions factories and ship yards and things like that. About 6 million people left farms in order to work in urban areas, including several million southern black and white sharecroppers and tenant farmers. This mass uprooting made Americans both more cosmopolitan as well as lonelier. Some who moved far from their hometowns left behind their traditional values. Things like housing shortages, left millions living in converted garages or trailer camps or even in their cars as the cities were scrambling to try and keep up with the massive influx. Overcrowding and wartime separations also strained the family life as well as the community life. High rates of divorce became quite common. Mental illness, family violence, juvenile delinquency all have some sort of roots in this sort of social upheaval that characterized the war years. Few boom communities had the resources to supply their swollen populations with things like transportation or recreation or social services. And so you have conflict accelerating as a result of that too. While military culture fostered a sort of sexist mentality emphasizing the differences between femininity and masculinity, millions of American women were also donning pants and wrapping their hair up in bandanas and going to work in industrial settings and defense plants and the like. The government that previously discouraged women from employment were now proclaiming that it was their patriotic duty to join the war effort by going to work. And more than 6.5 million women answered the call and entered into the labor force at that time. Before the war, most female wage earners had been young and single. By contrast, during the war, about 75% were married with children. 60% were over 35, and more than 33% had children under the age of 14. And so they're trying to balance all of that, often on their own, as husbands and brothers and fathers are off on fighting the war in most cases. They were also now doing jobs that were traditionally seen as masculine jobs. They were driving taxis, operating cranes, welding hulls of ships. You have the image, the rather iconic image of Rosie the Riveter doing what was all traditionally seen as a masculine job, all in the name of the war. However, traditional attitudes and gender discrimination still existed. Throughout the war, most women workers were clustered in women-only jobs, and women in manufacturing tended to earn about 65% less than what a man would earn for the same amount of work. The stigma attached to working mothers also shaped government resistance to establishing things like child care centers for women who are employed in defense industries. The Labor Department Child Bureau went so far as to say that a mother's primary duty is to her home and her children. This duty is one she cannot lay aside no matter what the emergency. And so the expectation is that you're supposed to do your patriotic duty and work in war industry, but you also have to do your duty as a woman and a mother and take care of your family, and we're not going to give you any help for any of that. Funds for federal child care centers covered fewer than 10% of defense workers' children, and the young tended to suffer from this, but also you would have a lot of times women calling in or not turning up to work because they had things that they needed to do at home because of that lack of aid as well. The impact of the war on women and the family proved multifaceted, though, and even contradictory in some way. As the divorce rate was going up, so was the marriage rate, and so, in fact, was the birth rate. As some of you probably saw when looking at one of the Life magazines, they talked about a baby war and the U.S. birth rate going up as compared to Germany's birth rate, which was not. More than 300,000 women also joined the armed forces, and for the first time in American history, they were given regular military status. They were able to serve in positions other than that of nurse, and they were given ranks as well in the military. Overall, women gained a new sense of their potential. The war proved their capabilities and widened their world in some way as well. Some of these women were among the 350,000 teachers who took better paying job for war work, who took better paying war work as jobs, or joined the armed service, and this left schools very badly understaffed. Students, too, abandoned schools in record numbers as they sought employment or even sought to join the Army itself. The loss of students to war production and the armed services forced colleges to also admit large numbers of women and contract themselves out to the armed forces. So you see a fundamental change in colleges and the way they're run. Higher education became much more dependent on the federal government, and most universities sought increased federal contracts as well as subsidies because of that growing relationship between the two. The war very profoundly affected American culture. Spending on things like books and the theater doubled during the war. The film industry reached its zenith in 1945 and 46. But as the war is continuing on, people began to grow tired of war films. And so Hollywood turns instead to reemphasize romance and nostalgia. Popular music also was affected by the war. Bookstores, nonfiction was quite popular, and news magazines increased in circulation. Wendell Willkie' One World, which was published in 1943, became a very fast-selling title. It reached 1 million copies within 2 months and presented a vision of a world without military alliances or spheres of influence, and expressed a hope of some international organization that would extend world peace and democracy throughout the post-war world, which was kind of idealistically the American ideal for the end of the war. You also have an avid interest in wartime news, which spurs the major radio networks to increase their news programs from 4% of their airtime to nearly 30% of their airtime, which enticed a lot of Americans to listen to the radio on average about 4.5 hours a day in order to hear those news programs. Recognizing that the government needed the loyalty and labor of united people, a lot of Black American leaders entered the Second World War determined to also secure equal rights out of the conflict. One spokesman in 1942 insisted that African Americans' support of the war hinged on America's commitment to racial justice, and this became known as the Double V campaign, a double victory. Victory over the Axis, but also victory over racial discrimination. Membership in the NAACP multiplied nearly 10 times during the period. The association itself pressed for legislation that would outlaw poll taxes and lynching, decried discrimination in defense industries and the armed services, and sought to end disenfranchisement. Its campaign for voting rights gained momentum when the Supreme Court, in the case Smith versus Allwright, ruled that the Texas all-white primary was unconstitutional. A new civil rights organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, was founded in 1942, and they used nonviolent sort of direct action, the same forms used by Gandhi in his campaign for India's independence. And they sought to desegregate public facilities in northern cities especially. The president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a man called A. Philip Randolph, in 1941 called for a thundering march of 100,000 blacks on Washington if the president did not end discrimination in the armed services and the defense industry. And in response to this, Roosevelt agreed to a compromise. In June of 41, he issued Executive Order 8802, and it prohibited any discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies and by all unions and companies engaged in war-related work, and also established the Fair Employment Practices Commission to monitor compliance. Between 42 and 45, the proportion of black workers in war production rose from 3 to 9%. Membership in labor unions doubled from 1.25 million, or rather to 1.25 million, and the number of skilled and semi-skilled workers tripled in that time. Nearly 500,000 black women also found work in factories and the civil service. And overall, you see wage gains increase notably over this period. About 1 million African Americans also served in the armed forces. Wartime needs forced the military to end policies of excluding them from branches like the Marines and the Coast Guard, or restricting them to jobs like mess boys in the Navy, or confining them to non-combat units in the Army. And so you see many more African American servicemen getting more responsibility-laden jobs and entering into more branches of the service as a result. The number of black officers also grew to over 7,000 by 1945, and included one particular group pictured here, at least a portion of them are pictured here, the Tuskegee Airmen. They were, the first class was 5 African American pilots, and they were trained in Tuskegee and graduated in March of 42. They manned both fighter planes and bombers, and eventually flew more than 1,500 missions over Italy and the Mediterranean, and earning numerous awards for their service. The great majority of black servicemen, however, served throughout the war in segregated service units, often commanded by white officers. This indignity was made worse by the failure of military authorities to protect servicemen off the post, and by the use of white military police to keep them in their places, which sparked a number of riots on military bases. Violence within the military mirrored growing racial tensions at home as well, as black citizens began protesting against discrimination much more actively, and a lot of white citizens resisting those efforts led to increased instances of conflict. The fear of continued violence led to a greater emphasis on racial tolerance by liberal white citizens, and to a reduction in the militancy of a lot of African American leaders. However, the war did jolt the kind of racial status quo in ways that would lay a foundation for the eventual successful civil rights movement. The migration of hundreds of thousands of rural southern blacks to either cities in the South or in the North and West transformed race into a national concern as opposed to a regional one. And as the growing numbers of black Americans in northern cities began to vote, African Americans could hold the balance in especially close elections in those areas. African American expectations of greater government concern for their rights also resulted from the new prominence of the United States as a major world power in a predominantly non-white world. As Japanese propaganda would appeal to the people of Asia and Latin America, emphasizing things like lynchings and race riots in the United States, Americans were forced to confront the peril that resulted from white racism and that the danger that was posed to national security as a result. In addition, you also have white Americans faced with the horrors of Nazi racism, which serves to kind of discredit our own racist attitudes in this country. A pluralist vision of American society now became part of official rhetoric and a part of the sort of liberal agenda. The contradiction between American ideals of freedom and equality and the actual state of African Americans became quite manifest in American society, and it was something that it became increasingly difficult for Americans to ignore as time goes on. The war also brings changes for other minority groups in America. More than 25,000 Native Americans served in the armed forces during the Second World War, including about 400 Navajo code talkers who used their native language, essentially, as code for American movements and things like that, and were impossible for Japanese code breakers to determine because the Navajo language was very complicated. And so they, I think there's even a film made about it. I think it was called Wind Talkers, about these Navajo who contributed to the war effort in that way. There was another 50,000 Indians who left the reservation to work in defense industries, on defense plants and places like that, mainly on the West Coast, but also in the South. It was the first time that most of them had lived outside of the reservation in a non-Native American world. The average income for households tripled during the war, and this kind of economic improvement encouraged a lot of them to remain outside of the reservation and to make attempts to assimilate into mainstream American culture. But you also have a lot of discrimination towards the Native Americans, especially in smaller towns near reservations. Many were forced back into their reservations afterwards, which had suffered severely from budget cuts and other things like that during the war. There were those who wanted the land, and so they pushed lawmakers to demand that the Native Americans be taken off the backs of taxpayers and freed from the reservations, largely motivated by essentially greed, people who wanted the land the reservations were on. In order to mobilize against that campaign to end all reservations and to trust protections, you see an organization, the National Congress of American Indians, form in 1944 to try and counter that movement. In order to relieve labor shortages in agriculture, the U.S. government also negotiated an agreement with Mexico in July of 1942 to import braceros, or temporary workers, to come and do mostly agricultural labor. So this is, not even a decade after the U.S. had actively deported even some Mexican Americans, American citizens of Mexican descent, because it was felt they were taking jobs, and now we're negotiating to bring them back in order to do those same jobs again. These people were classified as foreign laborers rather than as immigrants, however, and it's estimated that about 200,000 came into America to work, about half of them in California, and they would receive sort of short-term contracts that promised sufficient wages, medical care, as well as decent living conditions, but farm owners very frequently violated those terms. And the contracts also encouraged a huge influx of illegal migrants to come and to stay in America, desperate for some kind of employment and better living. They came in like that as well. At the same time, you have tens of thousands of Mexican Americans who left their agricultural work that they were doing for factory jobs, or in shipbuilding or in steel mills and places like that. And even as their occupational status as well as material conditions were improving because of that transition, most of them remained in sort of isolated ethnic communities, and were sort of segregated from the larger society, and often received quite harsh treatment from police forces. A lot of the hostility towards Mexican Americans focused on young gang members who wore zoot suits. They did a lot to arouse the ire of servicemen who were stationed on leave in places like Los Angeles, where you have a high population of Hispanic people. And those servicemen saw them as delinquents and draft dodgers. And after one highly publicized trial, newspaper headlines indicated a crime wave led by these Mexican-American young men, more often than not. And this prompted bands of sailors and soldiers to go rampaging through Los Angeles early in June of 1943, stripping the suits off of these men, cutting their long hair and beating them until military authorities were finally forced to do something about it. For the most part, they looked the other way. The police intervened, usually only to arrest the Mexican Americans, and the city council made wearing a zoot suit a misdemeanor crime in Los Angeles in response. Nothing was really done about substandard housing or disease or racism that Hispanics had to endure, and quite often they're a minority group that gets forgotten in our sort of civil rights dialogue and things like that. But they did have a challenge to face as well, to say the very least. More than 350,000 Mexican Americans, however, did serve in the armed forces without segregation, and all of them in combat units as well. So within the armed forces, they didn't face quite the stigma that African American servicemen did. They volunteered in higher numbers than was warranted by their percentage of the population. So a higher percentage of them volunteered in the armed forces than the percentage that they actually made up in the population. And they also earned a disproportionate number of citations for distinguished service, as well as 17 medals of honor. So they all performed with particular distinction. You also have another minority group, thousands of gay men as well as lesbians who served in the armed forces and found new opportunities with the war itself. The military officially barred anyone defined as a sexual pervert, LGBT, but owing to the sort of urgency of the war itself, needing to build a massive army, just 4 to 5,000 men out of the 18 million who were examined were excluded because of homosexuality. Being emancipated from traditional expectations and the rather close scrutiny of family and neighbors, as well as living in overwhelmingly all-male or all-female environments, brought a lot of freedom to these individuals, and they were also able to meet a lot of like-minded individuals in that environment as well. Many of them, like all minorities, really, saw the war as their chance to prove their worth to the society, and hopefully use it as a sort of springboard for greater civil equality later. Much more than any other minority group in the United States, Japanese Americans suffered grievously during the war. About 37,000 first-generation Japanese immigrants and nearly 75,000 native-born Japanese American citizens were interned in relocation centers and guarded by military police, which is a reminder of just how fragile our civil liberties are, especially in wartime. If you remember our discussion during the First World War about cases like Shinek, where freedom of speech came under fire because it was seen as damaging to the war effort to allow dissenting opinions to come out. And in the same way that the First World War, we saw sometimes violent actions against anyone who was of German heritage or had a German name, or Italian heritage or had an Italian name. Germans and Italians managed to escape in the Second World War. the greatest generation was much more capable of making the distinction between fascists, Italian fascists, or Nazis, and Americans of German or Italian descent, but they failed utterly at making the same distinction for Americans of Japanese descent or Japanese immigrants to America who had very little to do with the actual Japanese empire. And so that is probably one of our biggest black marks as far as the way that the war was handled on the home front. The internment of Japanese American reflected about 40 years of anti-Japanese sentiment on the West Coast especially, and it was rooted, like most discriminatory actions, in racial prejudice as well as economic rivalry. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, politicians and others sort of whipped up the rage of white Californians. They were aided by a government falsely reporting that it was Japanese Americans in Hawaii who aided Japanese naval forces. And the result was moving all of these people to, sort of forcibly moving all these people to these interior camps. In February of 1942, President Roosevelt gave in to the pressure and issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized the removal from military areas of anyone deemed a threat. Although not one single Japanese American was apprehended for espionage or sedition, and neither did the FBI or military intelligence uncover any evidence of disloyal behavior by Japanese Americans, the military ordered the evacuation anyways from the West Coast. Only, interestingly enough, Hawaii was accepted. Japanese Americans in Hawaii were allowed to stay, which seems a bit odd given that Hawaii was the one that was actually attacked. No internment policy was implemented there, and no sabotage occurred in Hawaii either. Japanese Americans lost an estimated $2 billion in property and possessions as they were forced to sell everything they owned at whatever prices they could obtain quickly. They were tagged with numbers rather than names, not unlike Jews in the concentration camps in Germany. They were herded into barbed wire encircled detention camps in the most desolate parts of the West in the Great Plains. Few protested the incarceration, however, stating that it would not question government claims of military necessity during a time of war, which seems impossibly noble to me. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the evacuation when it was challenged in a case in 1944. Overall, about 18,000 Japanese Americans, however, served in the military. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was made up entirely of Japanese Americans and became one of the most decorated military units possibly, and quite probably because they felt they had something to prove. In 1982, a special government commission concluded in its report that the internment was not justified by military necessity, and it in fact blamed the Roosevelt administration's action on race, prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And to apologize to those Japanese Americans, in 1988, Congress voted to pay $20,000 in compensation to each of the nearly 62,000 surviving internants, or internees. So the people who actually went into the camps received compensation roughly 40 years later. In 1998, Bill Clinton further apologized for the injustice, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom was given to Fred Korematsu, who was the one who challenged the internment, and it eventually came to the Supreme Court, and he was denied ultimately. But he was honored much, much later, nearly 50 years later, in 1988 by President Bill Clinton. And like I say, remains one of the biggest black marks on our conduct during the Second World War. And again, gives you some example of just how fragile civil liberty is. in any country, really, even ours. So that wraps up the discussion of the home front. Now we're going to turn our attention back to the war itself. And the first thing we'll talk about is how the members of the Grand Alliance, Churchill, Roosevelt, soon to be replaced by Truman, and Stalin, went about planning and discussing what would happen after the war ended. By this time in 1944-45, the war is all but won. We're really just sort of polishing off the details, really. Germany is completely surrounded by Allied armies. Invasion is inevitable, and it's happening, actually, as we move into 1945. We're on the doorstep of Japan at this point as well, although that was going to be much more of an uphill battle than the campaign in Germany. But everything is starting to wind down, and so the leaders are now directing their attention to what happens next. By the time Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Yalta, the Soviet city of Yalta, in February of 1945, the military situation was entirely favorable to the Soviet Union. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were contemplating the outrageous cost, as far as American casualties, as well as sort of the economic cost of actually invading Japan. And at this point, in February 1945, we're insisting that gaining Stalin's help was worth almost any price. And Stalin was entirely aware of this, and so he was in a position to make demands of the United States. And he also had the luxury of deciding whether and when he would enter the Pacific War, and we were pretty much at his mercy at that point as well. In the Yalta Accords, which resulted from that meeting, Stalin again vowed to declare war on Japan in 2 or 3 months after Germany's surrender, which Germany still hasn't surrendered at this point in February. Churchill and Roosevelt reneged on their arrangement with the Chinese nationalist leader and promised the Soviet Union concessions in Manchuria, as well as the territories it had lost in the Russo-Japanese War, all in an effort to gain Stalin's help in the Pacific theater. This group also delegated a final settlement of the German reparations issue to a post-war commission and left some vague idea as to the matter of partitioning Germany up and then eventually reunifying Germany afterwards. They also called vaguely for interim governments in Eastern Europe, broadly representative of all democratic elements, as well as eventually freely elected permanent governments, which was something that Stalin gave into, but he wasn't particularly keen on allowing to happen. Particularly important to Roosevelt, the negotiators also accepted a plan for a new international organization and agreed to a founding conference in San Francisco in April of 1945. Stalin proved adamant about the nature of the post-war Polish government. It was twice now in the last 40 years or so that German troops had used Poland as a springboard to invade Russia, and Stalin wasn't going to have that happening again. And so he was adamant about creating a Poland with a government favorable to Russian or to Soviet interests. Conservative critics later charged that FDR essentially gave away Eastern Europe, but actually the Soviet Union had complete control over Eastern Europe. It was the Soviet Union that had liberated, and I say liberated in quotation marks, Eastern Europe. And so Roosevelt was not in a position at all to make too many demands in that area of the world, because if we go with the old adage that possession is 9/10 of the law, the Soviets had possession of Eastern Europe, and they were more than willing and more than able to enforce their ideas and their programs in that area, and we pretty much had no choice but to sit back and let them. So as the Soviets are preparing their assault on Berlin, American troops crossed the Rhine River in March of 1945 and encircled the Ruhr Valley, which is sort of Germany's industrial heartland. Churchill now proposed a rapid thrust towards Berlin, but Eisenhower and Roosevelt saw no point in risking that number of casualties, and so resolved on a much slower advance. Eisenhower advanced methodically along a very broad front. Americans met the Russians at the Elbe River on April 25th. By then, the Red Army had taken Vienna. They'd reached the suburbs of Berlin, and on April 30th, Soviet troops attacked Hitler's headquarters in Berlin. He committed suicide, and Berlin officially fell to the Soviets on May 2nd. Days later, on May 8th, a new German government surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, and that was the official end of the European War. Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, as May 8th became known, came less than a month after they had mourned the death of their president. On April 12th, in a meeting, Roosevelt very abruptly grabbed his head and moaned that he had a terrific headache and then fell unconscious. A cerebral hemorrhage was actually what ended his life, and I believe I said it was something else in class, and I apologize for that. As the nation grieved, Roosevelt's rather unprepared successor, as we discussed in class as well, assumed the burden of trying to end the war as well as dealing with the Soviet Union. And it didn't quite go as well as we would have hoped, I suppose. Roosevelt had made no real effort to familiarize his vice president with world affairs, and perhaps sensing his own inadequacies, Truman sort of overcompensated by taking rather hard-line positions, especially when it came to dealing with Stalin, and that wasn't really the best approach to dealing with Stalin. He lashed out at a Soviet ambassador to the United States as he was tired of waiting for the Russians to allow free elections in Poland. He threatened to cut off Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union and reduced economic assistance to the Soviets as well. Simultaneously, Stalin moved to strengthen his grip on Eastern Europe in response to all of this. And so actually, it was all of these brash movements by Truman and then response in kind by Stalin, which really led to the sort of devolution of American-Soviet relations. The United States neither conceded the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, nor did we particularly try to end it. Truman still sought Stalin's cooperation in establishing the United Nations, as well as in defeating Japan, but relations between Americans and the Soviet Union were deteriorating rather rapidly. By June of 1945, any hopes for a new international order had dimmed considerably. The United Nations emerged as a diplomatic battleground. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin met at Potsdam in Germany in the summer of 1945 in order to complete post-war arrangements that they had begun at Yalta, but by this time, without the sort of military element keeping them somewhat in unison, they could barely agree to demilitarize Germany and punish Nazi war criminals, which should have been a rather obvious decision to make. So any more difficult decisions were obviously going to be less likely to come about. And so everything kind of going downhill quite rapidly as far as diplomacy goes within the Great Alliance itself. And the alliance is breaking up, basically. Originally, when news of the Holocaust first leaked out, early in 1942, many Americans didn't believe the reports. It wasn't until November that the State Department actually admitted knowledge of the massacres going on in Germany. Most Americans considered the annihilation of Europe's 6 million Jews beyond belief. There were no photographs that came out to prove it, and some argued that the atrocities attributed to the Germans in the First World War had turned out to be false, and so any atrocities attributed to the Germans in this one were called into question equally. Very few took issue with the military's view that the way to liberate any of those enslaved by Hitler was by speedily winning the war, and so didn't want to take any kind of special action against these camps. pleas by American Jews for the Allies to bomb the death camps and the rail tracks leading to them fell on deaf ears and were ultimately disregarded as well. Still, in the United States government, there was never any real serious consideration of rescue schemes or any real search for a way to curtail the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish question. Its very feeble response was due largely to its overwhelming focus on winning the war as quickly as possible. Congressional as well as public fears of an influx of Jewish refugees into the United States also weighed on that decision. Britain's wish to placate the Arabs by keeping Jewish settlers out of Palestine weighed on that decision, and the fear of some Jewish American leaders that pressing the issue would increase anti-Semitism at home, which was actually fairly prominent. Anti-Semitism was not something that was confined to Germany. Germany took it the furthest. Hitler and the Nazis took it the furthest, arguably, but the sentiment was well known and extremely prominent in America and other countries as well. It was only after viewing the photographs and the newsreels of corpses stacked like cordwood and boxcars heaped with the bones of dead prisoners, bulldozers shoveling bodies into hastily dug ditches, and liberated barely alive people lying in their own filth, as the photograph here would indicate, that most Americans actually believed that the Holocaust was happening and it wasn't just a myth made up to scare them. And you still have Americans today who would deny that this ultimately happened at all. And so again, another kind of mark against America's conduct during the war, our willingness to ignore these atrocities until it became absolutely impossible for us to do so. While all this is happening in Europe, America is still at war in the Pacific with the Japanese. Early in 1945, an assault force of Marines invaded Iwo Jima, which was about 700 miles from Japan. The Marines very savagely battled thousands of Japanese soldiers, and it was a very difficult uphill battle for those Marines. Managing to secure this 5-square-mile island would cost Marines nearly 27,000 casualties, and about 1/3 of all the Marines killed in the Pacific died at Iwo Jima. In June, they waded ashore on Okinawa, about 350 miles from Japan, and a key staging area for the planned U.S. invasion of the Japanese home island. 83 days of fighting on land as well as on sea, 12,000 Americans dead or wounded, 3 times as many wounded in fact, and a 35% casualty rate, which was higher than that at Normandy, characterized the invasion of those of that island of Okinawa. The appalling rate of loss on Iwo Jima and Okinawa combined weighed very heavily on the minds of American strategists. The Japanese cabinet showed no willingness to give up, and they were essentially going to force Americans to invade the home islands. Military leaders insisted on fighting to the bitter end. In Japan, surrender was considered unthinkable, and Japan possessed an army of more than 2 million men, plus another 4 million on reserve, plus another 5,000 kamikaze aircraft, which were psychologically terrifying to any who came across them. The idea of someone so willing to essentially make themselves into a flying bomb was disturbing on a psychological level for a lot of Americans. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff initially feared that it might take 18 more months of hard-fought battle and more than 100,000 American lives before victory could ultimately be achieved in Japan. But all of that changed with the successful detonation of the world's first nuclear bomb. This gave Truman an alternative to the unconventional invasion of Japan. On July 25th, while he was meeting with Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam, Truman ordered the use of the atomic bomb on Japan if it did not surrender before August 3rd. In the Potsdam Declaration, as it became known, he warned Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan decided to call America's bluff and refused to do so, and on August 6th, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima. More than 60,000 people died instantly from the blast. Another 75,000 died from burns and radiation poisoning by late 1945. Still, the Japanese government was not swayed, and so 2 days later, on August 8th, Stalin declared war on Japan, and U.S. planes moved in to drop leaflets on Japan, warning that another bomb would be dropped if it did not surrender again. The next day at high noon, another B-29 boxcar flattened Nagasaki with yet another plutonium bomb. This time, 36,000 were killed and another 60,000 were injured. On August 14th, finally, Japan accepted America's terms of surrender. General MacArthur received Japan's surrender on the battleship Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, and this officially ended all the fighting in the Second World War. While Americans at the time overwhelmingly backed the dropping of the atomic bombs as a necessary way to end the war with the least cost to America and American lives, many historians have subsequently questioned the necessity of using the bomb itself. Some believe that America's rather racist attitudes towards the Japanese motivated the decision. As one war correspondent wrote, the Japanese are looked upon as something inhuman and squirmy, like some people feel about cockroaches or mice, which made it easier to make the decision to kill overwhelming numbers of them at a single time. However, most of those involved in the Manhattan Project regarded Germany as the target of their bomb rather than Japan. And considering the ferocity of Allied bombings in places like Hamburg or Dresden, which claimed actually more victims than Hiroshima or Nagasaki, there's very little reason to assume that the Allies would not have dropped the atomic bombs on Germany had they been available before Germany surrendered. Other critics maintain that demonstrating the bomb's terrible destructiveness somewhere uninhabited would have motivated the Japanese to surrender. It is impossible to know now, of course. American scientists at the time rejected the demonstration. The atomic arsenal, as I mentioned in class, consisted of only about 2 bombs, and they didn't know whether the mechanism for detonating them in the air would work. And so a failed detonation would probably actually set us back rather than moving us forward. Others were persuaded that worsening relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union would required some kind of scare tactic, and that dropping the atomic bomb would serve to scare the Russians into submission, and that there was some interest in ending the Pacific War before Stalin could enter it, so as to keep him out of the peacemaking process. Critics also charged that the bomb was used primarily to intimidate the Soviet Union rather than to secure victory over Japan, but in fact, no military or political leader that advised Truman at the time debated not using the bomb. All of them were for dropping it. Given the ferocious Japanese resistance on islands like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the likelihood of a very difficult uphill battle on the home island of Japan was pretty inevitable, and Truman saw no reason at this point not to save American lives over those of his enemies. Every new weapon that was put to use with this sort of concept of total war that we see in the Second World War very easily accommodated the bombing of civilians. The atomic bomb was just one more item in an arsenal that we had already worked with deadly effect. And before Hiroshima, the United States had already crossed the rather callous threshold into mass murder from the air with our fire bombings of Tokyo and the rather devastating bombings in Germany. No member of the committee formed to advise Truman on the use of the bomb counseled that the U.S. should sacrifice American servicemen in order to lessen the death and destruction in Japan. The nation, as they saw it, had unleashed a wanton and brutal attack on Pearl Harbor, and to not use the weapon would essentially be a giant waste of money. The United States had spent $2 billion trying to come up with the bomb. So at the time, there seemed no good reason not to. The atomic bombs ended the deadliest war in history, a truly global conflict which involved over half the world's people and some 15 different nations who participated. Armies raged over continents, navies fought over every ocean. The war affected women, men, children, civilians, military. No one was really left unmarked by the war. And although physically unscathed, the United States had changed profoundly as a result of this global conflict. And we can see that as we move into discussions of the post-war world and the Cold War, which dominated that for many decades afterwards.